All right, I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar on voter rights and accessibility. I'm Marty Exline with AT3 Center, and with, of course, with Election Day coming up on November 3rd and huge turnouts expected, it's more important than ever that persons with disabilities know their rights and abilities to vote in accessible fashion. We're happy to have presenting today Sachin Pavlathran, the program director for the Utah Assistive Technology Program, and also a member of the Election Assistance Commission's Board of Advisors, and Rylan Rogers, the director of public policy, of course, for the Association of University Centers on Disability. I want to remind everybody that if you need to see captions, click on the CC button on the control panel. It should be at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions or comments during the presentation, please enter them in the chat window and we'll address them either at the conclusion of the panel or at logical stopping points. Just for upcoming events, remember to check in at the at3center.net events page. And we'll also, as we always do, send out links to either the AT3 listserv or the Community of Practice listserv for the particular webinars. And then lastly, please do complete the post webinar surveys when you receive them. We especially want to know if there are topics or issues for future webinars and events that you'd like to have presented. And with that, Kim, you can stop sharing your screen and we'll go ahead and turn it over to Rylan Rogers.
So good afternoon. I wanted to confirm that you now see my screen, which is a slide that at the top says hashtag vote 2020 and beyond.
Yes, we do. Looks good.
Great. Thanks so much. It's really exciting to be here and to engage in this conversation with all of you today. Lucky to be tag teaming with Sachin, who has deep expertise on this topic. We really view this as a critical conversation for this moment. As was mentioned, we're 20 days away from the election, but also as a critical conversation to help us all prepare for what comes next. We know that this election is unusual in many ways, and it will likely lead to conversations about voting rights and accessibility in our country. And we know that you all have tremendous expertise to offer for the moment and for the conversations to come. So we hope that today gives you some additional things to think about and ways to start to organize how you can share that expert information in the post-election change and systems that will come forward. As mentioned on the screen, we really want to focus on the fundamental right for all American citizens to cast a vote and to cast a confidential ballot, which is sometimes a challenge when we think about barriers to accessibility. And then really think about the rights of people with disabilities and what that means in terms of accessibility and different components of it, and how we can use our expertise and the work that we do together in individual programs to move that forward. I'm having a little bit of a technical something. My slide is not advancing. There we go. So we wanted to start with all good things and make sure that you're aware that there is a couple of different forms of data at the national level related to voter experience, specifically related to voters with disabilities. I'm sure that there may be additional sources of data in your states, and actually it would be really helpful to hear a little bit more about what are you go to as a reference point around accessibility. I think the most notable thing about the two data sources that we often turn to is that they've been collected for multiple years and they will be collected again this election. So it gives us a little bit of a snapshot over time, and we can see change and trends and continuing issues. The two most often referenced national pictures about voter experience in the disability space. One is called the Go Voter Survey, and it comes from the self-advocacy organization, SABE. And they've been providing this opportunity for input since 2014. And really it is a survey that gets results based on who responds to it. So they work hard to share it through their network and other disability organizations. Perhaps this is a survey that you have disseminated or promoted in the past. If not, it might be one that you're interested in sharing with folks that receive services from your center this year. But it asks a standard set of questions about information that voters get, issues, experiences they have, including those of poll workers, and really that access to completing the ballot. The other point of survey, and I'm going to turn to Session to give us an update on sort of what's happening this year, but is much more in the AUCD scientific space of a survey that we think about in terms of evidence and research, because it uses established survey sampling methodology, and it really has looked at disability voter and turnout since the 2012 elections in getting both rates of participation for people with disabilities and collecting information on their experience. Sachin, do you want to update about what that survey is going to look like this year and when we might have results?
Yeah, so the Elections Assistance Commission, one of the works that we've been doing over the last several months is really how can we get good data to inform what the commission needs to do when it comes to accessibility barriers that people with disabilities currently experience across the country. And, like the couple of the data sets Rylan mentioned, we have some data, but it's not to the level that we need to really make a case. So I'm excited about the survey the study that's going to be done this November. The contracts that has already been signed by a team that's going to be doing this study, and it's going to have more detailed data that's going to come out. I'm hoping by the end of this year, early next year, there's going to be a summary that comes out that can better inform the commission of how we can use some of the dollars that comes into the commission so that we can do testing within the commission, but also how to target certain states that are facing these barriers when it comes to accessibility. And when I talk accessibility, we're talking broad sense, how does people with disabilities, what kind of barriers they face getting to polling places, or if it's a state that does mail-in voting, what's that, what do they have for accommodating that, all those different areas. So it's not just targeting polling place or barriers to get into a polling place. It's a pretty broad data set we're trying to collect so that we have more informed, we can be more informed on how to best push some of this information to the states.
We wanted to pivot and really think about and take a dive into accessible technology, accessibility, and what is the role in voting. And as Sachin was mentioning, it's both a broad concept and very detailed at different levels. And we like to think about in terms of both rights and experience, 4 main buckets. I think the one that perhaps gets the least amount of attention, but is critically important, is accessible voter information. So as you all are aware and experience, how we manage elections in our country happens at the local level, often the county level. And each voting system is very different. and how they share information with constituents who are voters is very different. We are very aware, I think all of us, of the minimal standards for accessibility of websites. I think we're also painfully aware that at the state and county level, there remain significant barriers to website accessibility. And, you know, that challenge certainly feeds through other ways that information is disseminated. This is going to be particularly important this year because of the realities of COVID and how that's creating a state of significant change in how voting takes place. So many municipalities are dealing with the reality that polling locations are changing, that access and some of the rules around mail-in voting are changing either through government orders or litigation, and being able as a voter to access the current information in your community is critically important. Sachin, do you want to speak about the work you've done in this?
Yeah, so, you know, one of the biggest challenges, like Rylan was saying, is the lack of accessible information of what your county is doing currently because of COVID, how that has changed compared to how, you know, voting took place within your county or anywhere in your state. And the bigger issue is the web accessibility piece, where most counties around the country really don't have accessible websites. So getting information is, first of all, a huge barrier. And when you call your county clerk's office or when you call the Secretary of State's office, you know, whoever you reach out to, it's always a game of trying to figure out where you can get the information. So it is a huge challenge, especially right now. And one of the reasons it's a big challenge is, first of all, the information is not accessible, but secondly, not everyone knows what's happening because it's a moving target right now. How counties are going to roll some of these things out, because I don't know if you've heard, in certain cities, big cities, they keep shifting where drop boxes are going to be designated, how many drop boxes are going to be designated. From one day to the next, it's changing, and some of these places are not the most accessible for someone with a disability to get to because of transportation barriers or other barriers. So getting all this information right now is crucial if people are going to vote, especially you know, with the limitations on what accessible transportation is available for public transit for people to get to these kind of locations. So it'll be crucial for, you know, all of you who work with you know, this population, you know, working with people with disabilities, to have a general idea within the counties you are working in what that looks like, so you have that information to share. And I know some counties are doing a decent job, but most are not. So having that information handy if people reach out to you because of lack of accessible information would be an important piece to keep in mind while you're working with your clients. But I think it's also important to ask your clients, you know, do you need any kind of assistance or information when it comes to you know, voting? Do you have all the information you need? So that's another thing to keep in mind.
So beyond the real challenges with information, there are what are frequently well-known and understood challenges around accessible polling places. And this is the concept that you have a pathway to the building or the location that is free of physical obstacles. And then within the building, you have access to actually cast your ballot free of physical obstacles. This again has some very specific COVID type of complexity. One is that in many communities where polling is taking place is shifting to allow for matching the CDC guidelines around social distancing, that spreading of people and polling machines. It is also changing because of other regulations. So in communities where polling places may have previously been in a school, that school may not be hosting it this year. I think it's really important when we think about that access to the building piece. We often think about that as sort of the pathway from the car to the door and into the door. And in some communities and for some individuals with disabilities, it's also about those pathways from public transportation routes to the polling location. That's another level of complexity this year, as in some municipalities, there are public transportation routes and the number of options has decreased because of COVID. So really thinking through accessibility and all of those ways. This is often the common barrier where you arrive at the polling place and the accessible door is blocked or the accessible door is locked. And then so you're supposed to magically alert people by getting in the non-accessible door that the accessible door is locked. That magic is often beyond reach. So really thinking those things through. This is one of these pieces that we can be helpful in right now. You may be hearing from local election officials who are scrambling in this new environment, and they may be overwhelmed with the things to consider, and offering those assistance around your knowledge around accessible entrances and accessible barriers, and thinking things through around access to an accessible restroom, if there's going to be waiting, and what are the other accommodations that can meet those needs. This is where your expertise can be incredibly helpful. You often are also most likely to know what are the public spaces in your community that could be really appropriate substitutions in terms of an accessible voting place. So lots to be seen there. Go ahead, Sachin.
Yeah, the other thing is, one of the things I've already started hearing in the last few weeks, because voting started in many big cities, is accessible parking, because of how these are being rolled out, and because of the locations are not really designed to have a huge percentage of population coming at the same time. Accessible parking is becoming more and more hard to come by for a lot of these, individuals who are using, van lifts, lifts to, lifts within the van. That's become a huge barrier where they can't even get to the polling place, and if they do find a parking, is way out that it's not even feasible for them to get to the place because of other accessible barriers that exist. Because there's no one controlling or monitoring any of these activities that's going on. It's just a mad rush that's happening in most of these areas. So having those kind of communications going on, especially with all of you having the expertise within the counties that you work in, is important to be aware of, but also to inform people that this is going to happen when they go to vote. Now, small towns, small cities might not be as much of a problem, but bigger cities, it is definitely a problem right now.
And the other thing that we're deeply worried about, just based on preliminary information we're receiving from around the country, is the availability of poll workers. So in many communities, the tradition or the standard practice is that your average poll worker is most likely an individual who's retired, and this is part of their retirement activity and civic involvement. Many of us don't get to be retired until we are of the age that puts us at higher risk for COVID and a COVID infection and complications from that. And so there's this reality that some of our most experienced poll workers, which is a double-fold problem when we get to talk about accessible voting machines, are not going to be participating this year. And so when we think about accessible polling places, the worry is that on election day, some polling places will not have enough staff to be able to open. And then it sort of becomes a little bit, you can see the trend here, then it's about how do we get accessible information for people about what their alternative polling places that they're being redirected to. And how do we make sure that people have a choice that they're being redirected to that's accessible in all the ways.
The one thing I've been informing a lot of individuals who really want to take advantage of polling places that exist within the counties, do not wait till election day this year, especially this year, because of all the obstacles that exist right now. The chances of finding an accessible unit with limited polling places is going to be very slim. So if you have an option to vote early, and if you want to vote in person going to a polling place, take advantage of that early voting, just because of the complexity of the barriers that exist right now because of limited places where it's available, and plus the lack of expertise of poll workers, because of most of the poll workers who have the training from past elections might not be even available. So there's a good chance you're going to walk into a polling place with someone who has never set up an accessible unit ballot marking device.
Yeah. And I think you all are probably some of the most well-versed in the whole country around accessible voting machines and what the requirements are and the types of access and the range of disabilities that they serve. And you're also probably amongst the group of Americans that have heard the most about the real challenges that exist in terms of that. And as such, in referenced, it is not an uncommon experience to show up at the polls and the accessible machine hasn't even been set up. It is also not an uncommon experience to show up at the polls and poll workers not being educated and trained about how to support an individual in using those machines. So sort of being aware of the challenges, being aware of what an individual needs to cast their vote on an accessible machine, what type of machine they're looking for, and what are the right ways to support them in navigating how to locate that, how to have the greatest success in moving forward. And then the final category that we think about in terms of accessibility is really critical this year, but certainly not fully actualized. And that's accessible remote voting. Because of the increased risk for COVID in the category of many individuals with disabilities, the strong preference has been to vote remotely, vote by mail. And we are all painfully aware that for many individuals, voting by mail is not fully accessible. The paper ballot that comes via mail may not be fully accessible and able to be filled out independently and in privacy, and then they would need to have an individual to support them in the process. There are exceptions to this challenge. There are some counties in the United States that are using accessible remote voting. Some counties are using formats that are, and states are using sort of a one-sided option that you can receive your ballot electronically and that then thus could use it on your screen reader or whichever technology works for you to access that information. But then you need to return that paper ballot. And then in some municipalities, I'm thinking of Maryland, for example, then that ballot has to be transferred to a quote unquote standard ballot. So there's several barriers to that. There are a few places where people can both receive a ballot electronically and cast and return their ballot electronically. But that is not widely available. It becomes a real point of education when individuals are determining what they should do to understand what's available in their local precinct. Sachin?
Yeah, so, like Rylan said, there are some areas trying out these remote voting options, West Virginia being a state that's rolled it out in multiple counties. Utah's got it going in one county. So it's happening in pockets, but very, very few. The other issue I want to point out about the whole mail-in voting piece, which happens quite often, especially for blind individuals, myself, I have experienced this, is the signature piece. Now I can maybe have a family member help me fill out the mail-in ballot, even though that's not my preferable way. If I do that, the signature piece almost always becomes a problem, because when it gets to the when it gets to the polling place, at least the last couple of times I've tried mail-in voting, they have contacted me saying my signature is not valid. The signature does not match the record they have. Now, Utah does inform you that not every place do that. So pretty high chance your ballot's going to be tossed if your signature does not match. So that's another huge problem with mail-in voting when it comes to accessibility. Even if you have a family member that could assist you in getting your ballot marked.
That's such an important topic because it really is one that impacts a variety of different disabilities, and really, frankly, even the aging process. There are very few amongst us whose signatures stay consistent over time, and yet in many municipalities, for your mail-in ballot to count, your signature must match that of your voter registration. And as Sachin was mentioning, the ability to know what your on-record signature is possible in some places, so that you can work hard to make it match. But in other states and counties, there's no ability for the voter to know what they're trying to match. So that's a challenge as well. Wanted to take a moment and shift a little bit into the legal backing for all of the rights that are available for people with disabilities around voting, partly because I can't help myself, but also because I think it's really empowering for those of us that are helping folks navigate this election. And it's also really helpful as we're learning the lessons of this election and thinking about what comes next. I think many of us think about accessible voting rights, and we may attribute most of those either to the ADA or the Help America Votes Act. But really, some of the founding accessibility standards in voting go all the way back to the Voter Rights Act of 1965. And that's the right to bring someone to help you and to have the choice in who is assisting you as a voter. And that's really a critical piece for many individuals with different disability experiences. And then we've seen it evolve over time in terms of how the Rehab Act really moved forward, wheelchair accessibility in booths and accessible equipment. And then we saw the voting accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act. You could tell by the language how old some of these are. So that's from 1984. And there was more specific language there around some of the accessibility features in those machines. And then as we're all aware and still celebrating this 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, there was more around the right to bring your service animal, that really foundational right to vote privately and independently, which is critical when we think about where we are. And then I think many of us, and even our programs in our states, benefited from both the protections of the Help America Vote Act and some of the funds. It really was, in many states, the first round of funding that went to not-for-profits and agencies to do some of the technical assistance to help move local elections forward. I share all of this because I mentioned that we are a little bit at a tipping point, and many of the challenges of this election and really the challenges of this political American moment have created a new conversation around voting rights and voting accessibility. And it is really likely that following this election, new legislation will be introduced at state and federal level. At the federal level, we're expecting that the John Lewis Voters' Rights Act will be reintroduced in the new Congress. And at the state level, there will likely be voting bills that reflect some of the challenges that are experienced. This is a chance for all of us to make sure that the experiences that individuals with disabilities are having and the barriers that they're facing in this current election and historically are addressed in this new legislation. So it's a real chance for us to be educating elected officials, voting commissions, and others around these needs so that when we're moving forward, this is part of the conversation. Just not enjoying my computer right now. We spent a lot of time talking about accessible information, and this is a piece where your technical assistance in terms of real systems change making likely will be more effective post-election. Kudos to any of you that can get a county election or a state election website to be more fully accessible before November 3rd. Please tell me about it so I can share continuously. But we do know that the information barriers that people experience will change the discussion post November 3rd. So I would anticipate that you're likely going to be getting technical assistance requests from local and states about what needs to happen. I think it's a real chance to use your expertise and your consumers to do a little bit of a scan of what the barriers are and to share that back. I know that that's happened before in some states, and it can be some of the documentation to move forward.
I just want to, challenge folks to also, take some time within the counties that you work in to pull up their website and see whether you can even find information about accessibility. And it would be, I think it would be good data to have to see what you even find with it. Now, you don't have to go through every single county. If you can pick a couple of counties within your state to see how visible the information is for what accessibility options are available. I'm not even asking to check whether their website is accessible, just to see whether you can even find information that talks about accessibility when it comes to voting. That's also really hard to come by in a lot of these places. Some places might mention ADA, they use ADA for everything. They say ADA voting or whatever, but to see what is really out there. Then the other piece, with the clients that you work with, to gather some, few anecdotal stories that, that we can compile, as ATAP or AT3 to get a better grasp of what's happening nationally in all these states when it comes to experience for people with disabilities. Having a handful of anecdotal stories of what people's experience was like, how they voted, what if they faced any barriers, and if they did, what that was like, what kind of assistance they received and how they got the information. Those kind of few information would be very useful for us, as an organization to have, so that we have a better understanding of going to the next election. How can we better inform ourselves, but also how can we provide better technical assistance when we are, when we are contacted.
I think that's a really excellent point. The other piece I would add, as Sachin mentioned, voting is underway. I think we're close to 10 million ballots cast. So we're already starting to hear about some of the challenges. And it always been a helpful reminder to me to make sure that I have access to the right phone numbers for individuals that are experiencing a barrier to voting, for them to get it resolved, whether that's the local election commission or the local protection advocacy for the state. There are multiple, the ACLU has voting lines. So really thinking about who are the resources that you need to have at your fingertips so that you can help folks troubleshoot those barriers, and then also get that documentation of what the challenge is so it can get resolved. When we were looking at accessible polling places, I got a new to me question around how to deal with a barrier to access. It was a voter who went and it was available for early voting. The voter was a wheelchair user in a state with early voting, arrived at their polling location, and there were candidate affiliated poll watchers. So not voting officials, but individuals who on their own decision-making decided that they wanted to come monitor the election on behalf of the candidate that they supported. And those poll watchers were physically blocking the accessible entrance to the polling location. And the voter felt intimidated and concerned about particularly their impression of the poll watchers' beliefs, and they just felt uncomfortable. And so the call was, what to do, and that's different than a barrier that's created by an election official or a poll worker, as an outside organization, and navigating those pieces. So it was great to have some of those resource phone numbers to sort of talk through, because it was not a challenge that fit into a complaint with protection advocacy about voter access. Good news for this voter, actually the poll worker at the site visually identified that this was a problem, and asked the poll watchers to move and remove them from the situation, and the individual was able to cast their ballot. But there are unusual problems coming up, and then having the right resources to navigate those problems can be helpful at this point. I would say, though, other piece that's a little bit new and unusual in the accessible voting machine conversation this year is around safety and how we're going to use COVID protocols to make sure those machines are clean. And really there's a lot of folks that are reporting confusion. So we mentioned the poll workers might not be as comfortable with the accessible voting machines and as knowledgeable about them. And we've already heard from folks that are told, well, we don't know how to clean that machine because we'll break it. And so, how do you vote safely? And if you are given a stylus that was used by somebody before you. So those kinds of questions. So being able to give folks information to advocate for what they need and to advocate for their safety, and that it be equitable to the safety provisions that are being used for other voters. Sachin, would you have other thoughts or advice if people are running to individuals that need guidance on how to find information about accessible remote voting? That barrier to information, what's the best way to figure that out in a local community?
So, when it comes to accessible remote voting, like I said, it's happening in pockets, and the places where it's happening, it's a great thing that it's available. But to get that information, let me give you an example. So right now in Utah, for example, the county that it's taking place, one of the approaches that they've done is to have these devices taken to individuals' homes, especially to help out those who are in nursing homes, is an approach that they were taking, which came to a stop pretty fast because of COVID. So we are trying to figure out what is the best way that the information could be shared, that this is still available, but also how can we do remote voting in a way that for those who don't have access to equipment in their house either. So I really don't have the best answer for it, but it is, the complexity just keeps getting worse because of because of COVID, how to handle some of these things. The other piece we're running into is those who have caregivers that or guardians who usually assist in voting. And that's become a blockage in many places, which is a problem in many states as well. And that's another barrier that's being raised right now on what that's going to look like.
I think one of the other realities and challenges is even some of the language we use around opportunities for people to cast their ballot in the non-traditional ways is different. So in some communities, you'll hear about a traveling voting board or accessible home voting. And these, when certified poll workers are coming, and that's traditionally been an access point for people who are in nursing homes and congregate care settings. We know that COVID restrictions have limited the ability for outside individuals to come to those settings. There's been a lot of advocacy work to provide guidance about the ability for staff to support voters and to find sort of effective workarounds. I actually had a great conversation today with an advocate in the state of Ohio who lives in a congregate setting and was deeply concerned about her access to voting, and was able to advocate for and work out with the leadership of her setting that they had 2 of their staff become certified poll workers. And those 2 staff supported anybody who was interested in voting remotely, and all of that balloting happened yesterday. So she was delighted to report that it had been resolved, and and her ballot was cast. And I think that's a really great example of there are possibilities and there are solutions. I think the time is running out to get those solutions in place, but really thinking through what are the barriers and how do we problem solve around them can be critical.
One example to share my personal experience for this year's voting. So Utah just started sending out the mail-in ballots this week. I received my mail-in ballot yesterday. Now, I reached out to the county clerk's office asking what my options were. Obviously, I got the same runaround I get every year when I call. They keep transferring you to different places to get information. And this year it's even worse because usually I get hold of someone that I've spoken to before. This year it seems like everyone's new or they're not familiar with what I'm talking about. So this conversation back and forth has been going on for about a week. In-person voting is happening the week of the 26th. They still don't know what options they're going to give me. And so at what point do I decide that I take someone's help to send in my mail-in ballot versus wait for someone to get hold of me so I have a way to cast my ballot? So that's become a dilemma for me. So it's this waiting game because I don't want to wait too long for the mail-in ballot so that it doesn't get to the place at the right time.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of work to support people in having a voting plan, and to know that this year requires that. And Sachin's really articulating that for some of us, it means having a plan and a backup plan, and a backup plan for the backup plan. I am voting in the state of Indiana, which is where I've been sheltering in place for COVID. And I had intended to vote by mail because my pre-existing condition puts me at high risk. Got my mail-in ballot, but Indiana is not a state where you can see your previous voter registration signature. And I did the math and realized that I've been a registered voter for 25 years. Became a registered voter probably the week after I got married, so it was a new name to me. And I'm 100% sure that doesn't match how I sign things now. So then my backup plan is to be an early voter at a time that I can be more socially distanced and not in big crowds. So I'm going to do that because I wasn't confident that my ballot would be accepted for the voter match. So there's lots of challenges. And we talked a little bit about how do we sort of get through this election and then think about what the opportunities are going forward. And I do think there's a real value to being thoughtful about collecting these experiences now. I think you as a national network have an opportunity to raise those issues both globally and then in your local communities in a way that's really meaningful and bringing that expertise forward. I think this is the right time for us to pause and see if there are questions, other input to expertise to share with the group.
Thank you, Rylan. Angela from Texas did want to share a comment. She said that in Texas, a lot of people are lining up outside getting ready to vote in the elements because of COVID. they're still having 100-degree weather, and there's no signage about where to go for accessibility issues if you're voting in person. Like example, not having to stand in line. They will bring a machine to your car, but you have to call a special number when you get there. So there are some challenges in Texas, obviously. Then we also had a question from Tracy in New Mexico. Is there any guidance for a variety of screen readers for even online requests for an absentee ballot? In New Mexico, we have paper ballots, but there is discussion about online ballots in the future, which really affects screen reader access. Either one of you would like to comment on that?
So, there's, in regards to online voting or electronic voting, they use terminology differently in different places. There are different options out there. One of the companies that's done quite a bit in the space is Democracy Live, is a company that's tried to implement some of this in different settings where you can use your screen reader, and it's supposedly fairly, it's very accessible. It's definitely very accessible. So I don't know what, is it New Mexico or Nebraska? I forgot which state they were mentioning.
New Mexico.
New Mexico. Yeah, I'm not sure whether New Mexico is invested in anything or whether they've had conversations with, but Democracy Live is, one, and I'm not endorsing any brand here, but it is one that has received a lot of success. Another one is Votes, VOTZ, is a app-based voting system that's the one that's been rolled out in Utah, West Virginia, also used to use in the past. So there's different companies out there that are very, very accessible. Now in Maryland, Riley, you probably can talk more about this. It's an online version where you get your ballot mailed to you via email, and it's accessible, but the verification portion becomes a concern, because once you print out your ballot, there's no way for you to verify that it had all the markings in the right place.
Yeah, the Maryland is, not to criticize, but I think an effort to have a less expensive solution. So the idea that you could offer a clear document that somebody could use for any screen reader, and then that it would be printed by that individual, but the challenge becomes that that individual does not have the capacity to oversee when that printout is then transferred to a ballot that is used and goes through the ballot screen scanner to be counted. So there's a bit of a challenge in that space. They are using teams, so one Democrat and one Republican, to do that transfer so that it's bipartisan and has some safety there, but it's created some confusion about both the process. And then there's also the real barrier of, if you don't have access to a printer, then you do not have access to casting in that manner, because you cannot return the ballot electronically.
Thank you. Kiati Thomas made mention that she noticed there were accessibility devices and suggestions made. However, she is wondering, I am wondering what is available for the deaf and hard of hearing population, especially those with English proficiency, limited English proficiency.
Yeah, so I will start with the amazing work of Sign the Vote, which is an advocacy coalition in the deaf community that has been providing really remarkable information that is in both ASL and captioned and voiced. So all three modes of communication, and really clear information about various aspects of voting, various rights pieces. That is, really moving the access forward. It is not the same as making sure that in a local polling place that the needs of a deaf voter are being met in terms of different technology solutions. So, in the advocacy community, we're excited about that partnership because it's been a remarkable amount of effort and communication, but there are significant barriers in terms of access and really even that key piece where Sachin was saying about getting, if somebody needed an ASL interpreter to cast your vote, how do you navigate to get those kinds of resources when you're advocating for them? What would you add, Sachin?
I think you covered it.
Okay.
Catherine Crowley asked, in regards to having signature matching, if a person fills out their ballot but drops it off at their polling place, does that bypass the issue with a matching signature? Basically, is the issue only present if the ballot is mailed in, or is the issue associated with the ballot itself?
So the signature verification, if you take it, you need to make sure, even if you hand deliver this ballot, they verify that signature before you leave. Because once they take the ballot and they leave, someone else is going to verify it at some point. You need to make sure all that verification is done so that that question never comes up. So just because you handed the ballot over doesn't mean it's all good. Now, if you signed it in front of them and then they pulled out the verification, your signature, your vote, I can't think of the word, the card where you're, yeah, exactly. So till that step is completed, there's no guarantee.
I think that's also an important distinction, that you are not relieved from the challenges of signature verification if a ballot is submitted through a voting box versus the mail. So it's really that key piece. And this is another really kind of one of those issues that's really different in different states. So some states now offer the opportunity to track your ballot when you are returning it by mail, and you'll be able to electronically watch the process and know if there's a barrier. And then you would have an opportunity to what's called either clean or correct the signature and basically say, yes, that was my ballot and that's how I intended to vote, so it gets counted. But that is not an option that's available in every state. So if you live in a state that doesn't have that option, if your signature doesn't match, you would not necessarily be notified. So it's those real local differences that are important for individuals to navigate as they're thinking about their voting plan and how to make sure their vote counts.
Thank you. At this time, there are no other additional questions. There was a final comment made by Angela from Texas that in Texas, there's so many different counties that have different machines. They're all over their place with their accessible voting machines.
And that is the problem in most states. Again, going back to Utah, since I live in Utah, almost every county bids for different equipment based on what dollars they have to spend. So if you move from one county to the next, you might not have the same equipment. There's a pretty high chance you'll be, having different equipment, and the accessibility barriers within those equipment is going to vary from, from which device you're used to the next. So yeah, it's all over the place, unfortunately, since most, it's because counties make decisions on how they want to spend their dollars and which kind of equipment. I do want to re-emphasize something I said earlier, if this is at all possible for all of you to gather some anecdotal stories of people that you're working with, so that we get a better picture of what is happening across the country. I think it's useful information for us to have to really understand what voting looks like for people with disabilities. What are the barriers? What kind of methods people use, and what so that we really have a story to tell when before the next elections. And then we can also provide better TA going forward if we know what is really happening in this different pockets around the country.
Yeah, Sachin, this is Marty. I think we can do something to help facilitate that because I agree. I think that would be extremely valuable. So I want to thank both of you so much for putting together and presenting this webinar today. I'm trying to think of an issue that might be more important right now, but there's not too many come to mind. We will be posting the recording and the overheads on our website. And we'll send an announcement, so watch for those. And then we'll also be sending out a real brief survey, just asking about the webinar, seeing if there's other issues that related issues that you would have liked to have covered. So make sure that you submit that. Everybody will be receiving that probably tomorrow or Friday. So with that, I want to just check one last time, no more questions. So thanks again, both of you, Rylan and Sachin. We really appreciate it. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.